Recording a video during actual daylight with real light. What a novel concept. Now, I wanted to talk about a couple of different topics, so this one's going to be a little shorter than the epic videos of recent times, because I want to just focus on one specific thing, and then we'll kind of move on to some of the other things that I want to talk about in other videos going forward. There was a couple of comments that were made in a recent Personal Finance Dad video. It was actually recorded, I think, yesterday or earlier today. I can't remember what the exact timing of it was. I'll put a link to the video in the description. I check out a lot of Personal Finance Dad's videos. I think they're quite well made, and I agree generally with some of the principles. I did tease him a little bit in the comments though in that one, because one of the points he was making about this not being new, I was like, we are pretty well aligned on that same general concept, because if you were around during that initial time of the 1980s, you saw that. There were more collectors and investors back then. That's just reality. Now, with all that said, he did make some very interesting points that I thought were worth discussing a little bit further. One of them is that there is, of course, the greater availability of singles and cards in general, obviously, internet and all these different avenues, as opposed to the card shop and maybe flea markets or whatever the case may be, or if you wanted to buy packs, you might get them at a convenience store or something. Like, the options were a lot more limited back then, which is 100% true. I agree with that completely. There is one part where we do diverge a little bit, because the argument of that is that, so the greater availability means that while some of the packs and some of the singles and things get a little bit more expensive, it is easier for, say kids of the current generation to be able to get their hands on the singles themselves, even if the boxes and the packs and all that start to dry up in terms of supply with the increased demand. Now, real quick thing here. This leads, I'm going to start with one area and it's going to lead me to another one, but like I said, I'm not going to go into the super deep dive, but let me give you the high level. And then I want to kind of initiate the dialogue and the conversation. I want you to think about this a little bit, and then we can kind of talk about it a little bit more. Here's the short version. So let's say, forget about institutional money, because I alluded to that a little bit in the last video about this. But let's talk about one of the other points he made. So he made the point about the greater availability. Totally true. We're 100% in agreement. But the other point that he also made was that, what if the layperson, or, drawn from the big headlines of the LeBron James sale, $1.8 million for a sports card, what if that prompts and leads it to become like fully mainstream? And some of the people that were kind of on the outside start coming in, therefore demand rises. Now, on paper, that's 100% true. But while listening to it, it kind of made me chuckle a little bit, because I went to my bookshelf and I grabbed this thing. So that's good old microeconomics. The Microeconomics 101 book that I did. Now, I was chuckling because I was looking at this and I was like, how long has it been since I looked at this thing? This was from my first year of university, and this was back in 2002. So it's been 18 years since I looked at this thing. Seriously. And I gotta say, I don't remember how I passed this course, because just looking at it, it was a bit of a struggle and a bit of a slog even just to scan it again. I'm not going to torture you guys with an economics lecture on the concept of price elasticity, but I'm not going to do that to you. But what it really comes down to is the demand curve. So again, I'm not going to torment you and torture you. I'm going to spare you most of this. But the point is that the concepts of economics have not been violated. They haven't been changed. They still apply. Supply and demand. People say the word supply and demand, but for the most part, they don't understand what it really means. And rather than go into a big explanation about it, here's the short version. The short version is, there's a reaction, and the whole concept of the elasticity thing is that, either price and supply are affected by each other. And the level of that is the amount of elasticity you have, and there's calculations on it, and trust me, I was bored the first time I did it, and I'd rather not revisit that too much. But where it applies here, and where I think it is valid and important, is if the layperson comes in, like Personal Finance that suggests, and it's a fair point to bring up, if that happens, then the demand would rise. Now, based on that, the prices should also rise, and that's fair, and I think that's probably true. And where it gets interesting, though, and this is where I think it warrants a little bit more thought, and something that might be worth considering as well. What if some of them come in? Now, some of them may come in and they may be a little bit older demographic, so they might be like in the same general age range that we're in, because he and I are basically around the same age, so we kind of came up in the same generation. So at least we have that base of comparison to be able to draw from it. Well, if you bring in somebody else that's also from our generation, basically, what you're looking at a situation where, well, maybe at first the idea is that we're going to look at nostalgically. So if I think back on my favorite times, if I take hockey as an example of a thing, I've got baseball as well, but if I take hockey as an example, then I'm looking at, that late 1990s, early 2000s range, or even like mid early 90s when I started collecting. Those would be the nostalgic eras that I'd be looking at. So maybe those would be the ones that I'd be looking at first. But if at some point I get some interest or the inkling to be looking at more modern stuff, well, then that's where the demand would rise. Obviously, for modern, packs or boxes or whatever. Now, if I'm already in my late 30s, I have more disposable income in theory, maybe. Not everybody's the same, and I acknowledge that. But maybe I have more disposable income to be able to put into it. So now, again, demand is rising. The supply is static at the moment, but demand is rising, so the prices would go up. That's very sound, logical thinking. Here is the downstream implication. This is the part where I say there's more to think about here. Up until this point, and if you watch Sports Card Live with Jeremy, who does some really great interviews, some of the interviews he's done are with some folks from the hobby inside, like people that work with different card manufacturers. Up until this point, I would say to you, I will submit this for your consideration, is that the card manufacturers, a lot of the people that are working there now are people that grew up or were around the age when the overproduction junk wax era happened. The junk wax era is not now, because we don't have that anymore. We have numbered cards, we have more limited production, but we also have a smaller user base buying the stuff. You might be able to go to your Target or your Walmart and say, oh, but the shelves are empty. Well, that's because one person probably came by and emptied out the shelf. That doesn't mean 100 people bought the 100 blasters. It might mean 5 people bought the 100 blasters. That isn't the same thing. 100 people buying the 100 blasters means you got a lot of demand and a lot of collectors potentially, or investors or slippers or whatever. But if 5 people are buying 20 of them each and clearing out the shelf, or if they don't even make it to the shelf because somebody makes a deal with the manager, that's a completely different thing. Yes, it empties out the shelf the same way, but it's not the same. Why does that play into the manufacturer side of it, though? The reason I say there's a downstream implication is this. So imagine that happens. We get this increase in demand and prices are going up even more. No matter how much experience there is inside of these manufacturers, because some of these people were collectors or are collectors still, and they understand that you have to be very careful. You have to walk this fine line of profitability and overproduction. You don't want to kill the golden goose, which is to say you don't want to be producing so many cards that people realize you're producing so many cards that you basically re-crash the market. It's not what you want to do. They're scared of it. They're trying to avoid it. It's the sword of Damocles hanging over their head. And I bet you didn't think you'd get a sword of Damocles reference in a sports card video. But it's the sword of Damocles hanging over their head, and they're terrified of it. They want to avoid it at all costs. But it doesn't matter how much they want to avoid it. If at some point an executive walks by and goes, I'm getting frustrated that we are producing the product. We are making money for the dealers, we're making money for the flippers, we're making money for the secondary market, and we don't get any of that. You can already see signs that the companies have been making some adjustments to that, because think about, what is blockchain? Why does blockchain exist? Why does a thing like Project 2020 exist? Why do we have Topps now? Why is there the whole print on demand thing? Well, because Topps then controls it. There's no middleman. Topps can produce it. Now, they can put a flat fee on it. Project 2020 is $20 a card if you buy it on the individual card. And I think you can get it if you buy by volume. I think you can get it for like 15 or 16 bucks a card. You say, oh, 15, 16 bucks a card, whatever. But that's for one card. And Topps only has to produce whatever you order. So it's pretty much pure profit from Topps' perspective. So from their end of it, this is a direct way to actually take advantage of increased demand. So when people order 99,000 copies of the Shore Griffey, that 99,000 copies times, let's say $15 a card, that's $1.5 million in Topps' coffers. Yes, it costs them money to manufacture, it costs them money to get the holders, and obviously they had some supply issues with the holders, with the magnetics and then things like that. They became snap ties for a little while. There's a whole thing. That's a separate conversation. But just imagine, $1.5 million, and I'm being on the low end. It was probably higher than that. But not all profit, but a lot of profit. So something like those products exist because the manufacturers are looking for ways to do something to increase their bottom line. If the demand's going to be so high, they can't be throwing away potential profits forever. They're showing restraint, but at a certain point, if the layperson comes in and the demand legitimately goes up, what's going to stop somebody from eventually going like, guys, there are so many people in this right now. Nobody can get the blasters. Nobody can get this. Why don't we sell some of the... We don't have to sell the retail blasters because then they would get in trouble with their deals with the different retailers. But why don't we come up with a new box? We'll call it something else. We'll call it the Mega Box. Whatever. Just come up with a stupid name. the mega box, and we'll sell it directly through our website, and we'll limit it to like 3 per person. But then, in order to accommodate that, they're going to have to increase printing. No matter what, they're going to have to increase printing, because if there's more product, it's got to come from somewhere. You know, there's only 2 things you can do to increase the profitability if you're the card manufacturer. You can increase the price per box, or you can produce more product. Well, if that demand actually comes in. Right now, the demand is there, but the demand may or may not be like the example I gave. It's not 100 people buying 100 blasters. It might be 5 people buying 100 blasters. But if it becomes 50 or 100 people who want that 100 blasters, whether they can get them or not, if it actually becomes 50 or 100 people, lay people start coming in, then the card manufacturers are going to find it very difficult to resist the temptation to turn on the printing machine. And that is the part that's the downstream implication that becomes very interesting. That's where that supply and demand curve that I showed you briefly for a moment ago, that's where the demand curve starts to shift. Because in order to bring the curve so that the price, so that you don't have to jack up the price, well, then you have to jack up the supply. And if you jack up the supply, at some point, it's going to come to a head if the demand isn't maintained in order to be able to sustain it. And that's where it gets really interesting, because those people that come in the market, they're relatively new, they're dipping their toe back in, and at first they might be super enthusiastic. But then if the supply really does start to go up, if they start printing more of some of these products, how long do you think that demand can sustain? We're in the internet age. It won't take long for people to realize that there's a lot of boxes available. I don't care if Target's sold out. Panini's website has 500 boxes, and they're available for anybody. And then when that 500 boxes runs out, they print 500 more. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but what I'm trying to get at is if that was to happen, people would start to clue in pretty quickly. It'll happen a lot faster in this era than it would have in the 1980s or the 1990s. Because even though I mentioned already the overproduction era, one thing that I think gets underplayed is that the manufacturers didn't just do it because they wanted to wreck the industry. They didn't do that. They did it because they looked at what was happening at the time. The prices were going up. People were paying, $100 for a Jose Canseco rookie. These cards were like going off. They were becoming these commodities, and people were getting really jacked up and excited about all the money they could make in sports cards. Well, the manufacturer only makes the money that they do selling the boxes. And what happens is, at a certain point, they can't get any benefit from the secondary market unless they find a way to get benefit by taking advantage of the secondary market prices and producing more product to sell. Because they can only make money on the product that they actually produce. And if they don't produce enough product, they're missing out on those revenues, and they can only resist that temptation for so long before the principles of economics kick back in. Okay, I think that's enough for today. I wanted to avoid the economics lecture. I still ended up kind of giving a mini one, but the point is still the same. I hope that you understand where I'm coming from on this. All I'm trying to tell you, I'm not saying this is inevitable. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm saying this is a consideration. If the layperson starts to come in, then there's a very real possibility that we are creating the conditions required for the manufacturers to be able to justify increasing the printing. And if that happens, then all bets are off. And it's going to be very interesting to watch. So if you've got any comments or questions, I'd be happy to address them down. I'd love to get the conversation and dialogue going on this one. Let me know kind of what you think. Like the video if you like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I like to do videos like this from time to time where I do a little bit of a deep dive into a topic like this. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.